Hey, what's up, everybody? So this is something that I recorded over 3 months ago. In fact, it's a warnings guide. It's a really, really overly elaborated guide on how to deal with every warning in the game. I don't really know what to say. I am re-recording the intro. That's the main thing. That's the main thing I want to point out here. I can't remember exactly what I said in the intro. All I know is that there's something that happened about halfway through recording where I accidentally, because I was playing Deep Rock soundtrack from YouTube, and there was an ad break, and it played like an Opera GX ad, and I did edit that out. But basically, what I did, just sort of in the hours leading up to me recording this, I was re-watching the video. Just to make sure that it's okay, to make sure that I didn't need to re-record it, and I'm not going to re-record it. This much has already been proven by me doing this and not recording it. I'm just recording the intro. Because frankly, I think everything in it is fine. I think it works. I think there's a lot of criticisms that I would have of it, and I would still encourage you to leave them because I think more videos like this are possible. But I hope you'll forgive any, basically any criticisms, anything you think that's not good about it, I probably just agree with, and that's just fine with me. It doesn't mean I didn't want it to be better. It just means that I'm not in a position where, just with what the channel is, where I feel like re-recording something that took me over an hour to record, and that's why it was so bad for me personally, is because recording for over an hour, it was about an hour and a half recording, I'm pretty sure. If you cut, take, disregarding what was cut. And when that's just me on my own, just speaking the entire time, it was pretty bad to do. It was pretty awful. So that's why, another reason why I'm not re-recording it. But basically, the issue I mentioned about having the ad play in the background, that was cut out. But when I was re-watching it, I realized something else happened. A similar thing happened in the intro. It was about, the same thing happened. I don't think it's the same ad, but I could hear in the background voices that aren't my own. So I thought I just need to re-record the whole intro. I'll just record up to the point where I talk about the first warning, that being Cave Leech Cluster. And I still think this works. I think the only thing I should point out is that I mentioned something about rockpox boils on the lithophage outbreak one, which surprisingly, the lithophage outbreak guide, that section is actually perfectly up to date, except for the fact I mentioned that it's really dangerous to get up close to rockpox, especially with the drills. Obviously, it's not as dangerous. I still personally wouldn't recommend it. But yeah, I think that's the only thing I really need to point out. Apart from that, this is kind of what it is. And you'll see what it is when I actually get into it. So I don't want to waste any more time. I definitely want this intro to be shorter than the original. And that's kind of it. Keep in mind it is over 3 months old, but obviously not much has really changed. I don't think anything would change. And yes, this is coming out before a weapon build showcase, because I was in the best position to do this and to record a new build showcase, because the build showcases, of course, are going to factor in recent balance changes. And I think I need more time to digest those. So without further ado, here's my incredibly long and just over elaboratory warnings guide for Deep Rock Galactic. I hope you enjoy somehow, but it's not really meant to be enjoyed, it's meant to be educational. Anyway, yeah. Alright, past Harry, your turn. So, Cave Leech Cluster, well, actually, does exactly what it says on the tin. It's really not much beyond that. It causes there to be a higher number of cave leeches in the caves, basically. You're going to see this more often in where cave leeches normally spawn. It actually doesn't go out of its way to put them in unexpected places, which, in my opinion, is actually something that could be done. You're not going to get cave leeches in tunnels, for example. It's going to be in open caves, just the same kind of places that you always find cave leeches, except chances are there's going to be a lot more. Where you find one, you're very likely to find about 3 or 4 instead, which essentially turns what usually can get a member of your team is actually a team wipe waiting down in the caves for you. Pretty much every time that you would encounter one, it could kill all 4 of you if you happen to be playing in a full team. So, in terms of things that go without saying, using heightened senses. Heightened senses is a perk that allows you to break free of any kind of grab. Any kind of grab that holds you. So a grab. So because the stingtail doesn't really grab you, it pulls you and immediately lets go. Heightened senses is and I'm trying to do something here. There we go. There's heightened senses. It allows you to instantly kill something that grabs you twice during a mission. It also provides a sort of heightened sense warning around your screen. The sound effect plays as well when this warning is incurred that there is a nearby thing that is attempting to grab you. This applies most commonly in every mission type to cave leeches and Mectera grabbers, and also applies to, in other specific scenarios, Naraka trawlers and the Nemesis. And I actually believe that is everything that heightened senses works against. So in this case, you're definitely going to be more using it, especially if you're in solo. That is a big problem, I would say. Cave leech cluster, where if you end up getting caught out by them, chances are you're going to get grabbed because there's a lot of them. You know, if you get caught out, you might be able to, with quick reflexes, take down one or two. But the problem is, there's going to be more than two in this case. Another reason to use heightened senses, or at least if you're in a team of 4, or if you were just even in any kind of multiplayer situation, I would highly recommend that at least one person does run heightened senses, even if you wouldn't view it as essential in multiplayer, because obviously chances are you're usually only running into one cave leech at a time, so you can very easily kill the cave leech that has, say, grabbed your friend. But, you know, having someone with heightened senses means you're going to be more aware of them, mainly. Obviously your team can very easily handle the cave leeches from a killing perspective, but, you know, it helps to be more aware. It's very easy to forget. The truth is, I think this goes for most players, that heightened senses does not inherently increase the amount of alertness that you have in the caves. In fact, it just makes it even worse when you remember that they're a thing. And the only way that you usually remember is when they grab you. So a second piece of advice is for when you do know that they're there, which is using high-value target killing weapons. Things that kill weak enemies quickly, which might sound strange, I know. What I really mean by that is things that kill weak enemies quickly and efficiently. The best example of a weapon for this is the M1000, although I would say any of Scout's weapons actually can fulfill this role. The boomstick with incendiary compound can very easily, especially white phosphorus on the boomstick, I should say. That, for example, can easily kill cave leech from any distance, pretty much. Let's go to Scout on Carl. So the M1000 pretty much all the time. I think, you know, 100% of the time a base charge shot can do it. If you wanted to use the deep core, high value target killer is actually electron reload, because it can usually do in all of those weaker high value targets, at least over time. So that's a very effective way of dealing with them, because you know it's going to die, and chances are it's going to die before it does any real damage. Drax perfectly fine. I should say it's perfectly fine. It's not a crazy high value target killer, but it will get the job done quick enough. Secondary, like I said, boomstick with white phosphorus will probably kill it immediately from any distance, and bolt shark normal bolts will also do the trick very well. Slukovs fine as well, although especially with embedded detonators. All of these things can help you take them down very quickly. I would also say that the stun sweeper, Scouts most recently added grenade, is also perfect for this kind of thing, for multiple cave leeches. Say 4 is usually, Jesus Christ, that looks like a submarine. What the hell? Anyway, 4 is usually the highest amount that you're ever going to encounter. Sometimes it is more, but the point is that 4 can usually be killed by a stun sweeper. Obviously the stun sweeper's damage is not that high, but it can perform multiple hits as long as there's multiple enemies to hit, which means it can actually deal with cave leeches very well. It can also even alert you to the maximum number of them. Something else that can do this is, of course, Scout's flare gun. Yes, the flare gun. And also, I believe, yeah. Essentially, the second to last point here is using the smart rifle or the flare gun. Obviously, if you have a scout in your team, you always have a flare gun, right? And this speaks to the obvious thing of just keep an eye out on the ceiling if you can remember to do that. But as a scout, you should be using your flares a lot anyway, and these will help you spot cave leeches. In big rooms, you should pretty much always be putting them on the ceiling, because in really big rooms, there can often be more than one cave leech, even if it's not cave leech cluster. So I mentioned Buzzcoat here, giving Buzzcoat as much DPS as possible. And what I mean by this, what I mean by consider doing this is, me personally, I don't have Buzzcoat any stronger than he is at base. I give him extra revives or maybe extra mining speed, but I don't actually like making him stronger in combat. this leads to Cave Leeches killing me quite often, because he actually is very, very bad at it, especially on Hazard 5. But if you say were to give Bosco higher direct damage and also electric rounds, he can take care of Cave Leeches extremely quickly. It's like mainly in the context of you being grabbed by one. It's not much of a problem when Bosco can kill them so quickly. So if it ends up being a problem for you, just give Bosco good damage on his weapon, not rockets. Don't prioritize rockets. I never prioritize his rockets anyway, even if I am giving Bosco extra damage. It's always going to be for his gun. Okay, if you happen to be an engineer, there's a couple things here. We got turrets and smart rifle. So this is going to be a bit controversial, but turrets obviously can help with Cave Leeches. They're things that turrets can kill fairly quickly and also spot automatically. But the problem with this is, especially in larger caves, that turrets only have a limited amount of range and sort of scan angle. So both LMG Mark II and Hawkeye system improve the range and improve the angle at which it's able to spot enemies. I'd recommend LMG Mark II over Hawkeye system 100% of the time, though. I would definitely not combine the two. That would be extremely foolish. So you could use Hawkeye system if you find Cave Leeches to be a real problem. It also means that you can target them directly if you want to. But LMG Mark II is probably a better bet, only because Hawkeye system is so bad. I would, in general, proffer the idea, quite foolishly perhaps, of just hopefully getting to a point where you don't need to rely on a turret to spot Cave Leeches for you. I would say that's probably not a position that you want to be in. I also mentioned the smart rifle. This does work. It's just a small tip. If you just scan the ceiling with the smart rifle, it will pick up, especially with a wider lens. Although I wouldn't in general recommend using a wider lens. I'd recommend using macro lens in all situations usually. But if Cave Leeches are a problem, you can use a wider lens smart rifle to easily point them out on the ceiling. Okay, and the only other thing that's really class specific is the mention of the coil gun, because the coil gun of course can penetrate terrain, which means that you can potentially save a teammate who's been grabbed, even if you're not in the same room, potentially. I would say this is one of the few things, a very niche thing, where the mole and overclock, that actually increases the penetrability of the coil gun, the terrain penetrability, actually comes into play. It could allow you to potentially save a teammate that you otherwise would not be able to, although, and there are plenty of good coil gun builds, so if you're a gunner, I would probably say, why not take the coil gun into a Cave Leech cluster? It might end up saving your team. As simple as that. It's not a hugely important piece of advice. One last thing would probably be Dash. Dash is a fantastic perk that if you don't run, this is probably one of the warnings that that would be a good argument for you to take it. If you're having problems with Cave Leeches, it helps you get away from them quicker if you notice them at the last second. Of course, it doesn't help you if you get grabbed. And neither does Fawns, I should point out. I believe it was a myth at one point. It might have even been true at one point that Fawns actually did kill Cave Leeches. Now, there's a citation needed here. This could actually be true in lower than Hazard 5, but I can tell you that in Hazard 5, Fawns is not killing Cave Leeches at full health, at least. I can tell you that for sure. So, don't be relying on Fawns. Take heightened sensors. Consider taking Dash. Obviously, stay as aware as you can. Ideally have a weapon with you that can kill low HP enemies like in an instant. That's kind of what you want. The core gun is that in general, as like for gunner, I should point out. It's probably the best thing at that gunner has. So that's another reason to use the core gun if you're a gunner. Driller, obviously lots of bar to build, mainly with explosive reload. I would say Wave Cooker and EPC are fine because they have range. That's really it as a driller. So I would say Cave Leech Cluster is not the most dangerous warning. It has a lot of potential though, in terms of dooming your entire team, certainly. So consider that, and consider all these points, if you would please. Okay, next is Elite Threat. Elite enemies are more common than usual. Make every bullet count, plus 30% hazard bonus. So Elite Threat is originated from an older concept, or rather I should... Well, actually, yes, it is from an older concept of hero enemies. That's what it really dates back to. But where it was first introduced to players was in the form of update, whatever it was, called Modest Expectations. It's the update that preceded Season 1. And it introduced the concept of double warnings, and it also introduced the Stormageddon and Elite Threat warnings. And it also introduced the concept of elite enemies in general, because they were intended to be a larger part of the game as a whole. I think they had a place. It's very frustrating to me that they ended up getting removed, but this is the current timeline. But elite enemies still exist within the elite threat warning. There's lots of elite enemies. I can't list them all off by heart, but notable examples are, of course, Praetorians, Acid Spitters, Menaces for sure, Bulk Detonators, and Grabbers. Grabbers are a big one, so you could consider taking heightened senses, because Grabbers are evil in elite threat. They mostly because of how far they take you so quickly, which can sometimes be a bit of a boon, but you know. So something that I've noticed with elite enemies is that they're actually surprisingly frail. Their lethality comes more from lethality rather than endurance. They are higher, they do more damage, and they're much faster, and also attack faster specifically. Like a Mactera spawn, you can get elite Mactera spawn, and even though they're still quite frail, chances are it's going to shoot you before you kill it, because it's just that fast. So keep that in mind. This first point is a bit strange. I would say this is one of the least vetted sets of advice, because it's all just kind of based on what I feel like I've experienced, where armor breaking and direct damage are much more effective than status effects. Mainly temperature. Fire and ice are not what you want against elite enemies. It really doesn't work. They have a strong resistance to that kind of thing. I would say status effects that incur slowdowns are actually much better, or still worth using. Although I wouldn't sort of sacrifice damage for those kind of things, you know. If I was using the stubby, I'd probably take more direct damage over increased electrocution chance. But slowdowns are still valuable given the nature of elite enemies. But what's more valuable, in my opinion, is interruptive status effects. Those are being stun and fear. Obviously, stun and fear. And when I said interruptive, I mean that they interrupt enemy attacks if you inflict them. You know, electricity, neurotoxin, corrosion, these slowdown effects, they do not interrupt attacks, but stun and fear do. But in general, elite enemies have a much higher resistance to pretty much all status effects, mainly in terms of duration. So that applies to stun and fear as well. And so what we want to do is just increase chances, open duration, because the only thing we really want them for is interrupting attacks. Is especially useful for Macteras and Spitters and Menaces. Web Spitters and S Spitters. Actually, I don't think Web Spitters can be elite. I'm not entirely sure. And also Praetorians as well. Interrupting them is actually quite valid. If you're facing them down from the front, you do not want to get spat on by an elite Praetorian. Certainly not an elite radioactive Praetorian, which is probably the fastest thing in the game. They are terrifying. So yes, we want to specialise for direct damage and also stun and fear chance. So I guess the question could be good weapons for this, and I would say pretty much all of them except the flamethrower and the cryo cannon. I suppose it is difficult to really do exactly what you need as driller. Although, you know, think about it, he's got stun and fear on his drills, he's got stun on the axes, fear on the HE grenades. Your secondary weapon can incur certain effects. I would recommend taking the sludge pump. If I were to be really specific, I'd recommend sludge pump with the wave cooker built in some kind of way to incur as much slowdown as possible. Possibly protein disruption mixed with hydrogen and iron additive, and secondary wave cooker using it to slow down, contagion transmitter, and gamma contamination. I would also recommend prisoner necrosis being something that allows driller to deal a lot of direct, like very uninterrupted damage. It's the kind of damage that they can't really ignore or resist, so that's up there too. Perks, I wouldn't say there are any that are really specific for elite threat. It's much more about just strategizing and understanding the enemies that it throws at you. So you kind of just need to experience it and experience what works better against these different versions of these enemies. Although I have noted that stun and fear and basically it's pretty much anything except temperature, really, actually, because even the shard diffractor, its direct damage is pretty much good enough to deal with the enemies quite well. In fact, I would definitely recommend pairing the shard diffractor with some kind of electric build to make it deal more damage. Something like that would be ideal against elite enemies. I would say things that don't deal much direct damage at all, like the grenade launcher is another weapon that wouldn't do actually too much to elite enemies, actually. So consider not using the grenade launcher. Hyperpropellant, sure, but I wouldn't recommend that either. I'd recommend either the breach cutter or the shard diffractor. So go in for sort of those kind of things. I guess you could think about gunner or scout. I wouldn't have much specific advice, except for just using the best kind of builds that don't rely too heavily on status effects or explosives. It's direct damage and slowdown effects and interruptive effects are really what we want. Which I guess makes it strange why Driller, like Sludge Pump, I'm like sort of promoting that, but that's because it's the only one of the three that can really damage elite enemies particularly well, and that slowdown is still valuable. And obviously another point I put here is how high value targets such as Spitters and Mactera are even worse, so consider high damage per shot. Consider things that can put enemies down really quickly. I wouldn't blame someone, even though it's not my favourite weapon by a long stretch, I would not blame a scout for going for some kind of high damage M1000 on elite threat, or using embedded detonators perhaps. Any kind of build that could somehow let you actually get kill an anti-spitter or a Mactera before they're able to shoot is something that I can easily recommend for elite threat. So I would say try and find your way. I don't think many specific builds do exist, although a lot of the ones that I've already covered on the channel are actually quite good for this. For example, a recent gunner build that used the Hurricane and the Burt. My Robot Killer Engineer build is perfectly good for elite threat. It's actually very good. Scout, something like Impact Deflection with Jumbo Shells was also quite good. I would recommend that for elite threat as well. And as Driller, just use the Sludge Pump with any sort of combo. So yeah, that's what I've got for elite threat. It's not the hardest thing to deal with in the world. It's not the most unpresented challenge. It's definitely a step up from normal missions, but it's not strange. Not too specific, but there are definitely things to keep in mind. Okay, Explode Infestation. You'll be attacked by an almost constant flow of gifted exploder packs, plus 20% hazard bonus. No, it does not increase the chance of bulk detonators spawning. So, Explode Infestation is sort of a middle of the road kind of warning, strangely common as well, but basically it causes constant pressure waves of exploders to spawn. Very common. I would say probably there's probably every minute around that, probably maybe 2 minutes. I'd say it's probably less than 2 minutes. So yeah, and it sends out packs of exploders your way that will just do exploder things. But there's some things to keep in mind. First of all, take Vampire. This is an extremely valuable perk on Explode Infestation. Exploders are basically free health in this sense. There are things to be wary of with this tactic though. They always go down to a pickaxe hit, obviously multiple as well. So that's why I recommend use Power Attack, Recharge or Radius, so you can get more in the radius or just use it more often. Obviously you have to keep in mind you cannot use this all the time, and you need to understand that it will still make them explode unless you hit them in the face. You do have time, especially if you combine it with jumping, to get wave exploders before they explode. But to really take advantage of the Vampire thing, you need to be aware and be very careful, because you could end up losing more health than you gain if you're foolish. It's just that it's such free health that I recommend trying to get good at it, especially because exploders are fairly common anyway. So with a really specific thing, which is for Driller, both the cryo cannon and the wave cooker, they don't insta kill exploders, but when they do kill them, they won't explode. A frozen exploder will die as soon as it is frozen, therefore it shatters, and the wave cooker simply pops them. The Sludge Pump actually used to do this as well, but not anymore. But yeah, the wave cooker just pops them, so killing exploders with either of these weapons will just cause them to completely be disintegrated, meaning they won't explode after death. So I would consider using at least one of those weapons, one Explode Infestation. So yeah, on that. Ranged AoE options are good as they can take out many at once with one shot. I will be talking a lot more about cheap AoE, basically things that deal AoE with a very small amount of ammo. Something like the Hurricane can kill a group of exploders with only 2 shots very easily, because it's a high ammo weapon, but it still deals splash damage. Thunderhead is in the same category. Honestly, so are the Flamethrower and the Sludge Pump, and the Shard Diffractor as well. So I recommend pretty much any ranged AoE option like that. Nothing specific about them really needs to be done. Exploders are very cheap to kill on the whole, but there are some specific things. You know, things like how high value target killers are not what I would use for exploders, considering how easily they go down to just about any source of damage. So yeah. there's something to keep in mind about explode infestation specifically. The exploders that this warning spawns are different from normal exploders. Obviously, them spawning in packs is a slight difference, but they are quicker. They almost make zero sound, so they're better at sneaking up on you. And they do have a slight color difference to let you know that they are from the warning. This even applies to the radioactive ones, which, in my opinion, it's a really fun sort of mission. An explode infestation in the radioactive exclusion zone. That's a great time as far as I'm concerned. So, very basic bit of advice is Scout should attempt to lure exploders away. In general, someone should attempt to lure exploders away from your team. That's basically what it comes down to. Sort of. Someone should just spot them, really. You just need someone to spot them. Also, just shoot them whenever you see them as well. You don't really want to let them get close, especially if you're in a team, especially if you're like bunkering or something like that, although I really would not recommend bunkering on an explosive infestation. So, there's some specific things the engineer can do as well. Like always having turrets active. And by this I don't mean take a quick build and just build them as soon as you see explosions. That's actually a bit of a waste. But the ability of a turret that's sort of just sitting there to easily take out groups of exploders, or otherwise at least alert you to their presence, should not be undervalued. So, you know, if you're a forgetful engineer, stop being forgetful and put down your turrets more often. But yeah, explode infestation is not the hardest thing in the world to deal with, I believe. There's some solid tips here, I think. Some specific stuff for specific classes. I think the pickaxe thing's a bit of a universal one as well, so keep that in mind. But that's kind of where explode infestation stops. Quite simple. Can be quite deadly, but the workarounds, the ways to alleviate its danger, is quite simple and accessible, I think. Okay, Haunted Caves. A slow but invulnerable and deadly creature has been detected in this area. It will relentlessly chase you throughout the mission. Do not let it get close. Plus 30% has a bonus. Right. AKA Big H. The unknown horror that chases you throughout the mission. It's an invulnerable exploder. It's an invulnerable bulk detonator, I should say. It doesn't deal as much damage as a normal bulk detonator. You can survive multiple hits from it, but you don't want to get close to it. It's obviously a brutal warning. I absolutely hate it, but there are ways to alleviate these issues. So obviously check your terrain scanner regularly, because you can spot him on the terrain scanner. It's hard to in some areas. It's more easy when there's lots of terrain that's been uncovered, because the unknown horror appears basically just as a black sphere on the map, but it is there, so you can spot it. So check the terrain scanner regularly if you can't see him. So a basic bit of advice is attempt to cover long distances at a time whenever possible. So mining expedition, for example, just don't stop, really, if you can, when you're running through a cave. You know, you can mine nitro and Morkite while on the move. You don't need to sprint the whole time. You can slow down if you want to mine, but I would recommend getting from an open cave to the next open cave without really stopping. This gives you as much time to work in those open spaces before the unknown horror can actually reach you. Another thing that can alleviate this is engineer blocking up gaps, because the unknown horror does move slower when it has to dig. So if you force it to dig, then you are going to slow it down somewhat. So if you have an engineer who's got lots of ammo on his platform gun, it's not a complete waste if you can very quickly plug up some gaps. In a team, always ping the horror when you see it, basically. Obviously, don't ping it like constantly. Just make sure it's always pinged if you can, so everyone knows where it is at any given time. And when possible, this is when you're operating in a large open area and you might spend a lot of time there, so the horror is there, but you still need to be there. You want sort of two potential locations to hold your ground during your swarm, so you can sort of switch between the two. And you want to be aware of a way to get between the two that is quite simple. This could just be a large open area where you could easily run around the unknown horror, or even some kind of engineer bridge over. That could be a good idea as well. Basically, try and keep in mind the fact that you're probably gonna be forced out of an area, but you still want an area to hold your ground. You still want to be fighting swarms in good places to fight swarms. So, at any given moment, try to have at least two in mind, and that should help you. Some slowdown effects do work against the unknown horror as well, which keep this in mind. don't dump your ammo into it, but keep in mind that electric effects do work on the Unknown Horror. So if you have a stubby or anything that could affect electricity, it's not a bad idea to regularly inflict that if it's nearby. This should be elemental insulation and this needs to be vetted because, frankly, the wiki seems to imply that this isn't true. But the bulk detonator and the Unknown Horror inflict a damage over time with fire. That elemental insulation will negate somewhat. So consider using elemental insulation. If this is wrong, disregard it. If someone knows this, please put it in the comments. But this is an assumption on my part. Okay, this is a really important one. Keep the mule on the move as much as possible. You're going to be caught in situations where the mule is going to be behind the Unknown Horror. In large open spaces, it's almost impossible because they're basically move at the same speed. So you need to keep Molly on the move. You do not want her staying behind at the beginning of the mission, and you only cool her down, or she only ends up coming to you once you're like, the Unknown Horror is already ahead of her. That's not the situation you want. You also need to be aware of depositing in general, how you want to keep the Unknown Horror away from whatever you're trying to deposit into. So say you need to deposit in a refinery or a point extraction, the mine head. Try and lead the Unknown Horror away, give yourself a lot of room, and then go around it, basically. And then you can deposit. It's tedious, but you're going to have to do it, otherwise you're going to get killed while trying to deposit, and that's just debilitating. If you have to initiate a particular event, consider leading the horror away, or if it's already away, start the event as soon as possible. So this refers to any kind of event that you might encounter. Any machine event, any seasonal event, even things like Betsy or a Corlock, stages of a mission. Can't think of specific ones. Mainly elimination, mainly starting a Dreadnought fight. Basically, start them as soon as you come across them, as long as you're safe to do so, aside from the Unknown Horror. If the Unknown Horror is there, you're either going to have to face it, like getting in the way, being a massive hazard, or you could lead it away. That could prove to be far too tedious, especially in a mission that spawns passive swarms, or spawns actual swarms, I should say. Pressure waves are sort of non-negotiable, but in missions like Mine Expedition and Point Extraction, you really don't have the time to be leading it away. You just need to be quick in those missions, basically, if you have haunted caves. So, yeah, just be quick. Don't waste time with events. That's basically it. Take dash as well. If it's like, this is a very important one for dash. Consider I wouldn't consider other movement options particularly, because you just need to be able to move away at a moment's notice. Moving fast in general is not crazy good. Second wind could have some bearing here, some ground to stand on, because it makes you get between places faster, I guess. But yeah, in general. Also, if you're scout, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. You can easily grappling hook away if the Unknown Horror somehow manages to sneak up on you. But if you're not, I recommend dash heartily. And I should keep in mind, or I should point out, that dash is not, or haunted caves is not one of the reasons that I like dash. Actually, I'm just telling you it's almost essential on this warning, because I think it's essential pretty much anyway. Yeah, haunted caves is gnarly, but there are ways to alleviate it. You're never going to be truly rid of the horror, but you can slow it down. You can be aware of where it is at all given times, and you can sometimes, to some extent, alleviate the actual pain that it can inflict. So keep these things in mind, and especially keep in mind the issues that it causes you for trying to deposit at all. That is one of the times when the Unknown Horror is an absolute bitch, so just be careful when trying to deposit with haunted caves. Okay, next on the shopping block is lethal enemies. Melee damage from all enemies hurts a lot more than usual, plus 25% hazard bonus. Melee enemies. This is why I specify specialising for ground-based enemies, things that are much more effective against enemies on the ground. Yes, this includes like sort of mine-based things like mine layer system and cryo minelets, and even electro minelets, although I wouldn't recommend that still. Sort of things that work well against enemies that are grouped up on the ground, because grunt swarms are suddenly a lot more deadly. Because melee damage is very important to consider. There's actually no flying enemies that inflict melee damage aside from shredders, because I think shockers damage is purely electric anyway. So keep that in mind too. Take as many defensive upgrades as possible. So there are a few that you might not inherently be aware of, which don't take offense to that. something like Gunner's ones on the Thunderhead. We have damage resistance at full rate of fire. What a name! And also defense enhancement on the coil gun. Obviously, use shields regularly. Consider Veteran Depositor as a perk. Veteran Depositor is, in my opinion, a sorely overlooked perk. This will increase your defense while you are within 7 meters of the mule. That's at maximum upgrade. Actually, it's always within 7 minutes, within 7 meters of any deposit point. You will be more resistant to damage. Spec into stun chance to interrupt attacks. Now, interrupting attacks is not as essential. It's actually quite difficult to interrupt a lot of melee attacks. It often seems quite ineffectual. You're definitely going to be wanting to stop these ground-based enemies. So, fear, stun, AoE slowdowns like the sludge pump and the wave cooker and the cryo cannon, all valuable. Things like sticky flames as well. That includes volatile impact mixture on the shard diffractor. That's a little module on the shard diffractor. If you combine it with Catalyst, it's also perfectly valid. So there's a lot of ways to incur slowdown effects, which, you know, is always valuable, but it sort of jumps up a bit when you really do need to keep enemies away from you. You know, some builds don't mind enemies getting close to you because of the natural leeway that you have in not just getting insta-killed by them just because they're near you, but that's going to happen a lot more here. So, yeah, basically. So you also want to sort of have things that are good at close range, but you don't want to be going for close range, basically. So Warthog is actually quite a good weapon for this, because it's very good at mid-range, but also works at close range as well. Also, Electric Arc Stubby can also slow down enemies like in clusters at short range as well, so that can provide some use there. I could make a light recommendation of See You in Hell as an active perk, because, you know, if you're in a team, you might end up going down, so it would really help your teammates, especially because when they're trying to revive you, enemies can still accidentally hit you. Can still accidentally hit someone trying to revive someone. Enemies are not biased in that sense. They can still hit you even if they're not aiming for you. So, See You in Hell could definitely help your teammates if you're one that goes down. Much like Field Medic could also be useful, as it will fear enemies and also let you instantly revive your teammates, so you don't have to think about that. Also, Beastmaster is a perk that does gain increased value here, given that Steve does gain the damage bonus. This is not the only time this is going to come up. Steve will gain any effects that bugs gain, basically. So Steve will do double damage, which, you know, that brings into question which is more valuable, Slasher or Guard. I'd say take your pick. Steve can basically kill anything in a one-on-one, so, you know, take your pick. It improves them both quite a bit, you know. Yeah, lethal enemies is brutal, but you really do need to keep in mind that it's not even close to every enemy in the game. It could be a majority though, but, you know, once again, only melee damage, so just keep that in mind. We're going to be in close range situations more often than not, as in those are going to be the more dangerous ones, so specialise for that in any way you can, which usually includes anything that's more effective against tightly packed ground-based enemies. Stuns are more valuable, all that kind of thing. Basic stuff, but it still applies. Not many specific tips, I know, but I guess some stuff that is fairly specific is the fact that ground-based enemies are the more deadly attribute component of a mission with lethal enemies, and also that Steve is better as well, so keep those things in mind. Let's move on. Okay, a real doozy. Lithophage outbreak. The caves are infected with parasitic rockpox and must be purged using industrial cleaning tools, plus 50% hazard bonus. The big one, basically. This increases the chance of rockpox enemies spawning. It has latent rockpox enemies. Increases the chance of rockpox wave spawning, swarm type. Introduces rockpox enemies to the cave, sort of as ambient creatures, almost mainly just around the contagion spikes, but also adds the contagion spikes, which spawn those enemies, spawn lots of larvae. It infects you when you're on the terrain, and you have to clean them up as part of a primary objective using the litho tools, so that's going to play into this as well. Okay, Consider high ammo or pellet weapons over AoE and elemental weapons. Now, I'm often surprised at how good pretty much every kind of weapon is. But things with a lot of ammo and things with some kind of spread do actually gain a lot of value here. So that includes the Warthog. I've actually found the Warthog to be surprisingly good with its ability to actually take out reliably multiple blisters at medium range. So Boomstick may be slightly less so, even though that's the only other pellet weapon. But high ammo, so that's Stubby, Shard Diffractor. Breach Cutter is fantastic because of the way it pierces through enemies. Smart Rifle is terrible against Rockbox enemies, by the way. Minigun, Thunderhead, and Hurricane are all pretty decent. Hurricane's probably the lowest down. Bulldog, terrible. Coil Gun, not great, but it's the only secondary for gun, and that's any kind of good at all. But all of Driller's primaries are actually okay, mainly because of the way that they affect multiple enemies at once, and you can still pop the blisters. So I would say the elemental weapons thing is not particularly valid. I would say things that are purely AoE though, things like the Hurricane and the PGL aren't great against Rockbox enemies. They're not great. But yeah, the Flamethrower, perfectly valid actually, because you know they still propagate heat and you can potentially pop blisters with them. That's why I said crowd control is valid. Because slowing enemies down is always a good thing. Interrupting them as well. You can stun Rockbox enemies, so feel free to do that. It'll help you out. Okay, probably should move on from that, but just keep in mind, lots of ammo is helpful. So M1000 is also a bad weapon, which I love that. So is the Bolt Shock a little bit, which is not so nice, but you know, Drak, Boomstick, Zukovs, GK2, all very good as well. So just keep those things in mind. Not many grenades are particularly good. Turrets aren't great either, even though they have lots of bullets. They can't aim at blisters specifically, so they kind of fall apart there. So keep all of these things in mind. Take Dash. Dash is once again more valid. When you're cleaning up a contagion spike specifically, you can just be getting passively infected. And once you are infected, it becomes much more of a hazard, especially if there are Rockbox enemies around or other enemies. Taking Dash to sort of alleviate those effects should not be understated. So something else to do with being infected though, a very specific piece of advice that I've sort of put into practice myself, is when you're being infected, jump away from enemies at the last second. So if you're being infected and you're being attacked, right before you're about to get infected, jump in a direction that is away from them, probably the direction you're already going, and there's a high chance that as long as you're very quick, you'll be able to break free just after landing, so you can avoid a lot of damage. Damage that, you know, if you were dealing with a lot of enemies and you got infected and you weren't moving, chances are you die. But if you jump right before being infected, you have like a good window to almost break free of the infection, meaning they're not going to, chances are they're not going to do much damage to you. So yeah, just keep that in mind. It's a very weird tactic that I found to be extremely effective actually. When actually dealing with the contagion spikes themselves, always foam first. It's a big one. Now, the logic behind it could make you think that it's not that sound, but trust me, it is. Even in a team, foam first. You know, have two people foaming and then have two people vacuum. You don't want to be attacked while foaming. That's the point. And you can vacuum much quicker than you can foam. You do not need to be anywhere near as precise while vacuuming. So you can vacuum up all of it almost instantaneously. And yes, that will spawn all the enemies at once, but that just groups them together to be killed more easily, as long as you get away from the contagion spike before they actually start attacking. It works, but it does mean you need to act slightly quicker than normal. So, but it's still, in my opinion, the best way to deal with these things. Yeah, keep an ear out for pressure waves when approaching a spike. So I think that's fairly obvious. You know, you don't want to, if you use that tactic, you don't want to cause all the Rockbox enemies to spawn when a wave starts, when a swarm starts, or when a pressure wave arrives. So keep an ear out for any of that kind of thing. Pretty simple. Some Bosco advice. Bosco will, if there's no enemies around, he will automatically start vacuuming lithofoam. You don't inherently want him to do this, especially because of what I mentioned earlier. So what I tend to do, now you can just tap the Bosco, the button for the laser pointer, and that will cause him to become unguided. You can just keep doing that while foaming if you want. but I prefer to give him, if you grab the lithovac, drop it on the floor, and then point at it, he'll pick it up, and then he'll be basically disabled while you lay down the lithophone, and then you can make him drop it by directing him to start vacuuming, and then you can grab the vacuum as well, and you'll both be vacuuming, and you'll get it done much quicker. That's some very specific advice for that kind of thing. So in terms of other advice against the enemies themselves, something that I can't really confirm is that it seems like, so there is this thing that happens if you pop a lithophage blister at real close range, a rock box blister, it will actually deal a lot of infection to you. I believe that this disappears if the enemy is frozen, so keep that in mind. Also, I don't know why this isn't here. It wasn't meant to be. The wave cooker is just incredibly good at dealing with rock box enemies. Like, it's probably the best weapon for it, so keep that in mind. I think it's the best driller secondary anyway, so use it, please. Yeah, those are the tips for lithophage outbreak. I hope this helps. Next up is low oxygen, another doozy. The mission area has particularly low concentrations of breathable air. Dwarves must frequently replenish their O2 by standing near one of the tanks attached to the mule and other devices. Plus 20% hazard bonus. So low oxygen gives you an oxygen meter that constantly goes down unless you are in the presence of an oxygen tank, where it will go up instead, basically. And once it's run out, you start dying. You start taking health damage, basically. So a basic tip that should be written down here is all the things that have oxygen tanks on them. Any deposit point, so the Bodsco, the minehead in point extraction, the refinery in on-site refining. Okay, those are the only deposit points, to be fair. Actually, the drop pod as well. So all drop pods, the drop pod that you start in, the drop pod that you extract in, the drop pod, stationary drop pod in salvage op, also the uplink module and the fuel cell in salvage op. Also, Doretta in escort duty. Also, all resupplies, and the black box if that's an objective in a deep dive mission. So keep in mind all of those things. Resupplies are especially important. I'd say resupplies and the mule, because they're the things that you have the most control over. So obviously stick together. If people are spread out, that means the sources of oxygen are going to be more spread out, especially if it's the mule. And in general, just pulling the team apart like that means chances are you're going to suffocate and just die. So yeah, one of these things, something that plays into this very heavily, is the fact that the scout should never call the mule. Mainly because the scout is often far away from the team, and he's still going to need to do things that necessitate that. That's why the mule should always be with the other team members, because the scout is the one who can get back and forth the quickest. You should never call the mule to him. That's going to waste everyone's time and cause suffocation, basically. So I think it's pretty obvious why the scout should just move rather than call the mule. Find places to hold ground more aggressively. You don't want to be on the move during a swarm. Now, what I mean by this is be more effusive about holding ground. You know, be more like, oh, this is a good place, like to your team. This is a good place to stop for a swarm. Keep that in mind. You do not want to be on the run. You don't want to be running and gunning, because you want to know where your oxygen supplies are and have them close by during a combat scenario. You don't want to be thinking about oxygen when you're fighting a swarm. That's the worst thing possible. So yeah, use veteran depositor. Sorry, I actually missed one. Place resupply strategically, especially on non-mule missions and escort duty. So escort duty, why is that? Well, if you're running back, unless you can stick with the mule very easily in escort duty, to be fair, actually. But mining expedition, a mission where the mule can often take unorthodox routes, you might get stuck without it, and having resupplies dotted along the way can help you a lot. Also, things like point extraction and on-site refining, the only source of oxygen automatically is the minehead or the refinery. So if you say need to do like a side objective, like a machine event that's away from the minehead or the refinery, you're definitely going to want to resupply there rather than near the main hub, because you're going to need to spend time there. I would say this actually applies to offshoot rooms in those mission types in general. I would say populating offshoot rooms in any kind of non-linear mission is actually a good idea. You know, pretty much always have one in every Dreadnought room for elimination. You don't want to be relying on the mule inherently for that. So those sorts of things. Okay, opt for builds that excel when holding your ground. Don't know exactly what that means, but those builds exist. I know I do. Builds that sort of use lingering effects. There's lots of examples, like minelets of any kind. Simity mines, which I guess are minelets. Things like sticky flames, volatile impact mixture on the shard diffractor, sludge pump in general is really good at this. All of these sorts of things become extremely valuable when you have to stand your ground more often, because you don't want to be moving as often. So I hope that is obvious. Consider dash and other movement enhancers so you can find oxygen more effectively. Dash is the biggest one still, but I would say something like Second Wind does rear its head slightly. If you need to make long runs, especially for extraction, I can see Second Wind coming into play somewhat. Although I would say, if we go down to the very bottom, Sweet Tooth would be the best one for this. Sweet Tooth gives you more leeway because Sweet Tooth means that you get more health from red sugar, which is obviously good in a lot of scenarios. Say you're running out of air trying to find a oxygen source, Sweet Tooth will replenish more than normal and also give you a speed boost, so very obvious synergy there with the warning. When it comes to other really small things, like for example the choice between increased health or increased shield capacity for your armor, I would say take increased health because, you know, yes, oxygen drains your health directly, but the more leeway you have, the longer you have when you start losing health to find oxygen, or find more health. So, yeah. Swarmageddon. Prepare yourself for a tsunami of glyphid swarmers, plus 20% hazard bonus. So, you're definitely going to want cheap AoE options. So, I mentioned things like Shard Diffractor, Hurricane, Wave Cooker, we'll get to that, as well as lingering effects. So once again, things like sticky flames, anything that leaves behind some kind of trail, like persistent plasma, all of these kind of things, great for Swarmageddon. Auto aim options, so that is turrets and smart rifle pretty much, that's where that kind of ends. Boomerangs as well, of course, do this to a certain extent, so you could also consider those. So yeah. Use Fawns, probably the best perk for Swarmageddon. Kills tiny enemies very easily. It's not going to handle big groups very easily, but it's still going to give you some leeway considering how many swarmers there are. Fawns is still going to get a lot of value out of it. It's not going to be a lifesaver, but its value is still going to go up. Don't hold your ground. Run as much as you need, either to let Bosco and teammates do the work or to let the swarmers group up. So if you're, say, not using a cheap AoE option, if you're for some reason using the grenade launcher, you want really tightly packed groups of a lot of swarmers to make your shots worthwhile. So do not be afraid to run around and sort of goad the swarmers into being killed and things like that. It's really not something to be afraid of. Swarmageddon is an extremely punishing warning, so please do not worry about doing that at all. Especially if you're using some of the best builds for Swarmageddon, the kind of things where you run and gun, which we'll get into. Obviously, letting Bosco do the work is entirely valid as well. He can do that. When applicable, use hot rocks and other environmental damage sources to your advantage. So, if you don't know exactly what hot rocks are, well, it's basically the terrain in the magma core that sets you on fire. But obviously, it's not the only source of that. That's not the only example of hot rocks. So, lots of biomes have things that deal latent damage. Glacial strata has things that just release cold, which will instantly kill swarmers. Crystalline caverns has electricity that you could lead them through. Every biome, however, this is the best part, has meteorite strikes, specifically small meteor, which is so goddamn common. I'd be surprised if you didn't get one if you're playing a Swarmageddon mission. Chances are you will. And they create multiple areas where there are hot rocks, and basically hot rocks set swarmers on fire almost immediately, which means they kill them almost immediately. It's very effective to lead them through, or even just stand in hot rocks if you can find a way to be safe, either through a platform or mining a little bit out to make a safe area. And swarmers will just come at you and die. So I recommend that more so probably for swarmer swarms, ones that are announced. But either way, I hope you can see that. Do not be ashamed of using the environment to your advantage. It's only really valid here because of the way that pretty much all damage sources insta-kill swarmers. Otherwise, I wouldn't inherently recommend this for all things. Okay. Final tip though, 2 very specific things are Burning Hell minigun and Boiler Ray wave cooker. Burning Hell being a balanced overclock for the minigun, Boiler Ray being a tier 5 mod for the wave cooker. These things completely destroy swarmers to just a ridiculous degree. It's hilarious how good they are. Their value shoots up insanely. If you are either a gunner or driller, use one of those things. If you're an engineer, I would highly recommend using the smart rifle. I've actually found that explosive chemical rounds is honestly the best for it, which is really bizarre because it's very cheap AoE. Same with the shard diffractor. So any shard diffractor build is pretty good against Swarmageddon, especially with volatile impact mixture because of the magma being really cheap. Lingering effect as well. Scout, you're kind of boned. The best you can do really is like cryo or fire bolts on the bolt shark, and I guess maybe any kind of track crowd clearing. Obviously the boomerang can automatically hit like 9 at a time, but that's not actually a huge amount when we're dealing with Swarmageddon. So you could almost argue for any of the scout grenades as well. Obviously engineers also got turrets, so as long as you're active as an engineer, you should be okay. Alright, I've got to finish this because this video might end up getting canned anyway, because I'm pretty sure I accidentally played an Opera GX ad under the voiceover. That's great. Mactera Plague. Most threats in this mission will come from the air. The caves are full of Mactera, plus 20% hazard bonus. Basically just spawns a lot of Mactera pressure waves. Doesn't actually affect swarms, although obviously the two intersect. Because there's so many Macteras, you're just going to be fighting more Mactera on average in every situation. Mactera are weak to fire, so fire is great. Specifically, an incendiary grenade launcher handles Mactera swarms beautifully. I am going to actually show a very specific example, which is of the PGL. PGL proximity trigger and incendiary compound is wonderful against Mactera hordes. Proximity trigger I actually have come to enjoy quite a bit mainly because of the increased radius, but also because of the proximity detonation against Macteras. Works fine with Erdo 250, but I love it with Clean Sweep. Clean Sweep with an ammo and as big a radius as we can possibly get. Our radius is actually 6.1. It's actually 6.2 in game with this setup. Fantastic against Mactera hordes. What are you doing? Although, if I'm being honest, Mactera hordes reward a lot of different damage types, as long as you spec into them. You've got to spec into explosives on fire, or spec into precision and stun. Things like the GK2 and the M1000 are all absolutely fantastic. Even the Warthog arm breaking is actually rewarded because there's a lot more brundles. Anything that increases weak point damage. Cryo is actually worsened against air units in Mactera Plague because it sort of makes you realise that the cryo cannon itself is not the most ammo efficient thing in the world when it comes to actually taking down large groups of Macteras, which is why Snowball is a valid choice as well, and by extension cryo grenades as well. But a lot of scout weapons are very good against Mactera. The boomstick, Zukov's, GK2 and the M1000 all are. Even the bolt shock is the normal bolts can handle Mactera with exposed weak points quite easily. For Gunner, I would recommend not using the Thunderhead. It's actually pretty bad against Mactera, but both the minigun and the Hurricane and the Bulldog and the Burt are all really good. I've got something here about how Beastmaster might be fine because it can act as a lure, and because it's more Mactera than anything else, then he might actually not go. He might actually not just die. I don't know. Probably not. In terms of positioning, you want to be looking for wide and low tunnels. So you don't want to be in cramped spaces. You want spaces with room, but you want spaces that are low. So that keeps the Mactera easy to handle because they're not actually spread out as much as you might think, even if they have a lot of lateral movement. So yeah, that's the kind of situations where you're going to be best against Macteras. Also, I don't think I reinforced how great stun is on Mactera Plague. Definitely take stun in every way that you can, basically, except on the grenade launcher. If you're using proximity explosives such as mines or mines, place them on walls and ceilings. There are ways to genuinely use things like proximity mines and mine layer system for the Hurricane actually well against Mactera, because those are incredibly powerful explosives. This is really more just a tip of if you happen to be using them. You could also consider using heightened senses, because more Mactera means more grabbers. So heightened senses is the only perk that gets sort of a boost in Mactera Plague. So yeah, consider that. Right, parasites. Something is eating the creatures from the inside out and will go after you as soon as their hosts die. That's 15%. You can really just ignore it. It pretty much, to me, from my observation, it really only shows up in double warnings now anyway. Lithophage Outbreak has sort of pushed it out of existence. The parasites sort of just come out of enemies when you kill them. Bigger enemies drop more parasites. They're just sort of tiny enemies, swarmer types that sort of just flail around and go down to one hit from basically anything. So you could keep your distance if you want to, but the pickaxes deal with them very easily, so don't worry about that. And also Thorns is very good, and cheap AoE like Shard Diffractor or Hurricane work plenty fine. But the truth is, you can probably overlook it. Alright, regenerative bugs, which, I didn't really know what image to use, but, this guy's got a green bum, so makes sense. After a few seconds of not taking damage, the creatures will start recovering health, plus 15% hazard bonus. Self-explanatory. Avoid using fear effects. You don't want to be leaving things to die, because they won't die, If you fear something with, it's actually weirdly brings neurotoxin payload down a little bit, especially if you're using fear, because that won't work, basically. Long-lasting damage over time does work, but as long as you avoid fear, basically. So neurotoxin does work. The sludge pump, and fire in dense hordes also works quite well as well. Be selectively aggressive. You don't want to damage an enemy without killing it. Things that sort of move around and can very easily flee from you, like menaces especially, and also Coronars and Mactera grabbers. You want to focus on them. You don't want to fire at them casually, because they're just going to regenerate what you did with them, unless you actually just straight up kill them. Menaces are a pain in the arse in regenerative bugs. That's what you want to save your highest damage stuff for. Like I've said here. So there aren't really specific builds for regenerative bugs, but depending on what build you are running, you want to use the thing that deals the damage quickest. That's what you want to save for things that could escape and heal out of sight. Use Beastmaster. It goes up in value massively with regenerative bugs, because Steve gains regenerative properties. Any Beastmaster, any Grunt, mainly the Guard and Slasher, can 1v1 any given enemy, so as long as they can be left alone, they're going to last forever and kill just about anything that comes their way, except a detonator, unfortunately. Yeah, regenerative bugs, very simple. There are a few small things. In general, it's one of the more flat difficulty boosters. The most specific things are enemies that flee and also using Beastmaster. I'd also say, in general, avoid using fear if you can. Rival presence. Sensors have detected rival presence in the area, plus 30% hazard bonus. So this causes ambushes or pressure waves of patrol bots and shredders. Causes an increased spawn rate for Nemesis. Actually allows Nemesis to spawn more than once, specifically. That's actually the most important part of that. And also means that in every cave with it, in every mission with rival presence, there will be a turret controller, which is a structure that has a large array of all the 3 different types of turrets surrounding it that you can hack to deactivate the turrets. Yeah, that's basically how it works. You want to spec for weak point damage, because patrol bots are the most common thing, and they have prominent weak points that they suffer a lot from when shot. So weak point damage is very good. Also things that inflict heat quickly. Shard Diffractor, Hyperpropellant with Incendiary Compound, and the Flamethrower, and Burning Hell Minigun, and some Hurricane builds, and even some Boomstick builds. These are the best ones for inflicting fire. Also, Thermal Exhaust feedback on the Drac, although that mainly just works against turrets. It doesn't quite do enough to do patrol bots, but some fire weapons do pose a significant give you a significant advantage against rival enemies. Cheap AoE and auto aim options for shredders. Turrets, smart rifle, hurricane are all quite good against shredders, although in general they don't spawn in huge numbers, so a pickaxe mixed with thorns is usually enough. So you can kind of rely on that. Do not rush the turret controller, you'll get fucked. You just can't do it. Even the burst turrets are arguably the weakest link here. It's the combination of repulsor turrets and sniper turrets that will just completely decimate you. Do not rush it. Take your time, pick off the snipers, then pick off the burst turrets, then pick off the repulsors that you need to. In general, only take out the turrets that you need to allow you to get to the controller itself. You want to save ammo, so finding a way to take out the hack the controller without having to kill every turret is usually preferred. And if you can, cheese it. If you have a driller, have him drill underneath it. If you have an engineer, have him provide cover. If you have a gunner and you're really good, you can do it in just enough time where even if the shield goes down, you can do it quick enough where you're not going to die at least. So yeah, and I would say that you should probably prioritize snipers because they can get you from the longest range. Take increased power attack damage on your pickaxe because you can almost one-shot patrol bots and can one-shot all turrets with it. I think burst turrets actually do survive it, but still, it almost one-shots both of those things. And, you know, you can insta-kill burst turrets as well. No, repulsor turrets. And if you're a scout, you can do it to sniper turrets, although that's kind of strange. But it's mainly a patrol bot thing. It leaves them on such low health where you don't really need a weak point or fire damage source to do them in quickly. The power attack does almost all of the work. I would recommend any of the robot killing builds that I've proffered before in build showcases. I believe I can show you these actually directly on my profile on Carl. Let's have a look. So I think this is actually all of them. Yeah, we've got Robot Killer. So look at this. We give explosive chemical rounds because it's very good against shredders and doing some chunk damage to turrets and patrol bots. And can inflict electric generator, which allows us to get more damage with our shard diffractor, which is completely built for ammo and heat. We've got as much ammo as we can get with some direct damage as well in terms of weak point damage. Obviously high intensity heating and electric damage bonus. Apparently this build might be outdated, but it's not. It still works just well. I'm not actually sure what was changed since I made it. That's a bit weird. Apparently it can also be used with Stubby 22222 EM Refire. Sure. Big Game Hunter, Plasma Bounce. No. Anyway, some of the gunner builds that I've shown off as well, using ultramagnetic coils and jet fuel homebrew. When it comes to driller, best one is probably a sludge pump build that uses gamma contamination on the wave cooker. And scout, there's plenty. Lots of electric builds or even fire builds that you can use as scout to do quite well against rival enemies. So consider all of those points. Especially consider the main stuff like taking high heat sources or high weak point damage, take increased power attack damage, and just be very careful with the turret controller. Prioritize snipers and cheese it if you can. Do not be afraid of cheesing it. Okay, speaking of cheesing, shield disruption. Magnetic interference is causing all shields to malfunction. 30% hazard bonus. Consider all health-based upgrades. I'll probably briefly explain. Your shield is down constantly throughout the mission. There's no way of regenerating it. The reason why I put the shield here and it says that the shield generator and it says that it still works kinda is because it will still keep out enemies and enemy projectiles, but it won't actually regenerate your shields. So keep that in mind, and also don't use shield battery booster on the Drac. And also, yeah, consider all health-based upgrades, so anything that can increase health or give you more health, like Sweet Tooth and Resupplier, Vampire, and the other one on your armor, the increased health instead of the increased shield capacity, definitely. Opt for fear or immobilization effects. Obviously, the reason why you don't always do this is because sometimes more damage is worth taking over things that just crowd control, because you have some leeway with your shield to take some damage if you have to, where it's often worth it to just have more damage. But in this case, we want to be able to fear and stun things more often. Fear especially. I would say things like Hellfire Coil Gun with fear. just the grenade launcher in general. Fast Creek Catalyst for the Shard Fractor's got a strong fear effect. Fear on the autocannon. Boomstick has fear, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Things that do crowd control, though, like pheromone grenades on the Scout, are also very valid options too. Things that slow enemies down, like sticky flames, all of these kind of things. But you need to be able to hold your ground in shield disruption. So that's why I put here: do not be ashamed of using bunker tactics, as swarms can be extremely punishing. This was a second thing in that other point, where you can still be hit while running, but you have no leeway of your shield. Sometimes running away from enemies is a very perfectly good tactic to get yourself to safety. That kind of goes away in shield disruption, as a lot of ranged enemies are still very good at hitting you while you're on the run, and you have no leeway there. You're just going to suffer for no reason. You need to be able to stand your ground, and bunkering is a good way of ensuring that. Shield disruption is a really, really mean warning that you shouldn't be ashamed of using tactics that might otherwise be frowned upon in it. So don't be afraid of using bunkering. Don't be afraid of using any of... I think that's really the only combat tactic that is that. But either way, make sure you can always hold your ground, because running won't help. You're either going to hold your ground or you're going to die. So, yeah. Shield disruption. Pretty simple. Take health-based upgrades. Have good crowd control. And have good ways. Always try your best to hold your ground as often as possible. But that is the end of this strange little, or quite long, guide for all the warnings in the game. If this was helpful, then please let me know, and I'm very thankful if it was. It's really my first attempt at doing something like this. It was pretty long-winded to record, I'm going to be honest. If you can hear an Opera GX ad in the background, please ignore it. I'm going to... If it is there, know that I tried to cut it out. If it isn't there, know that I cut it out, basically. I definitely enjoyed preparing for this. It was a pretty tumultuous recording process, though. Doing it all in one sitting, my goodness. But if it was helpful, then you are very welcome. I am interested in doing some more things like this, hopefully shorter ones. If you have any suggestions of your own, or any advice of your own, please leave that in the comments for other people, and I'll make sure to like those comments or pin something specific if something really interesting comes up that someone has a tip for. But either way, that was how to deal with every warning in Deep Rock Galactic. If you enjoyed, please make sure to like, subscribe. You can click the notification bell if you're interested in more Deep Rock content, especially Deep Rock news. You'll stay up to date with all of that if you come on over to Barrel Vision. So, as always, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Take care.